Hi there, I'm Bob Walsh. A parade in Boston is always a stimulating experience. And Boston has many parades, like this one. The band members, students in a local high school, looking trim and fit in colorful uniforms, strut smartly to the rhythmic beat of the drums. Boston has another type of parade, too. A parade which has influenced the lives of each of us. The parade of history in the birthplace of liberty. Boston, sometimes called the hub of the universe, Boston is a city of firsts. It was here that the first blood of the Revolution was shed. Here the country's first public grounds were set aside, the Boston Common. The first public school opened, the first newspaper published. And here in Boston, the world's first telephone call was made, and the first ether operation performed. If you're a tourist, you'll probably visit Boston's historic spots by bus, starting at Copley Square.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are departing now on Gray Line's tour number 1 of historic and modern Boston. This trip is beginning where all Gray Line tours begin in this city, here in Copley Square. This square was named in honor of John Singleton Copley, who was a noted portrait painter residing in the city during the colonial days of the city. He painted portraits of such noted people as George and Martha Washington and also Paul Revere. This square is the dividing line between uptown and downtown Boston. No other square in the United States offers any more wonderful examples of architecture. For example, the church which is directly ahead of us, the Trinity Episcopal Church, is of French Romanesque architecture. If you look over your left shoulder there, you will see a good example of Italian Gothic architecture in the new Old South Church. And directly behind you, an example of the Renaissance architecture in the Boston Public Library.
Among the sights you'll see, Boston Common, which belongs to the people. The town bought it from a hermit, the Reverend William Blackston, in 1634, and dedicated it to serve as a training field and as a place for the feeding of cattle. Once a year, during National Dairy Week, cows are again allowed to graze on the common, and their mournful moos mingle with the din of distant traffic. In colonial days, according to tradition, pirates, witches, and Quakers were hanged on the Old Elm, which was near the Frog Pond. And on the tip of the common, near the subway entrance, the dignified Park Street Church, Peter Banner's masterpiece.
My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty.
A child, representing all American children, sings America, a simple act of faith with simple words and melody. We visit now the building in which the hymn America was first sung, the Park Street Church.
Free mountainside, let freedom.
Street noises disappear as you step through the side door of Park Street Church and walk down a short set of steps into a small reception area. This is the Reverend J. Murray Marshall.
Park Street Church was founded in 1809 by a group of people from the Old South Church in Boston, and immediately after, they resolved to erect a meeting house on the site of the town granary.
The spire of the Park Street Church is one of only 2 of the period which still stand today. The rest have fallen victim to hurricanes and nor'easters which rage up the East Coast. Within this spire, many feet above the congested street outside, a large clock calmly speaks in muted, unannoyed tones. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound is exactly the same as it was a century and a half ago when the clock was installed. And inside the rugged, tested steeple, there hangs also a famous and equally durable bell. Its tone is friendly, familiar, as it echoes across Boston Common.
We have a bell that was cast in the year 1809 in England, was brought here for the purpose of being installed in this tower. And It tolls on a Sunday morning, announcing the service of worship.
Once established, Park Street Church began to grow rapidly. And as the church began to grow...
Well, as the church began to grow, her ministry, of course, became influential, not only upon Boston, but also upon the entire world, ultimately. One interesting sidelight along the way, during the War of 1812, in the crypt of Park Street Church, powder was stored that was used by the boats of that day. And consequently, some people have dubbed this corner as Brimstone Corner.
Just outside the picture window in the pastor's study at Park Street Church, the Boston Granary. Buried there are many illustrious Americans.
There are several of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. For example, John Hancock, Samuel Adams. In addition, the parents of Benjamin Franklin are buried here. And someone who is familiar to many of the children of the land, Mother Goose, is also buried here. She was Mrs. Mary Goose, who lived close by.
The Park Street Church recalls with pride the name Samuel Francis Smith, a theological student and hymn composer, for from his pen came America.
When he composed this hymn, he gave it to his friend who was at the time organist here, namely Lowell Mason. And Lowell Mason set it to familiar music. And on July the 4th, 1831, this was first sung in America, and it was actually sung right here in Park Street Church by a group of school children.
The Animal Rescue League was founded in the vestry of Park Street Church in 1889, and there have been other contributions to American heritage and culture. Mr. Marshall, being aware of the historical background of this church and its place in the achievements of the past, does this give you satisfaction as you preach?
It gives one a great deal of satisfaction to know that those who have gone before have been concerned to provide for us today a heritage that is worthy. It is also instructive to me because it reminds me that the things for which these people stood have been passed on to us today in terms of our responsibility. And we don't simply glory in this church in what has been done in the past, but rather we are interested in doing in the present what needs to be done, and thereby providing for those who come after us a great heritage. We are mindful that we must meet today's challenge with the message for today, and we hope that those who come after us will be able to look with pride to us, but that they themselves will recognize their responsibility for their own day. We must apply the lessons of the past, and we must seek to meet with these lessons the problems of the present.
Of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of thy pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring.
You move up Park Street, past the State House designed by Charles Bulfinch and built on what was once John Hancock's cow pasture. Glance at Louisburg Square. Swing around and down to Tremont Street to King's Chapel. In the midst of busy downtown Boston, standing out from the confusion like a beacon of tranquility and peace, King's Chapel. A massive gray granite building. It was constructed on the very edge of a burial ground. Within King's Chapel, in a small office, the verger, Harold J. Haynes, whose lineage includes many vergers. King's Chapel was founded in
1686, and they had their first service down in the old townhouse, which the old State House now stands. And then in 1688, they acquired a corner of the old cemetery here, and became the first Episcopal church in New England, which was 1688.
The church was enlarged in 1710.
Then in 1749, King's Chapel was built around and over the old wooden church, and when it was finished in 1754, the old church was thrown out the windows in sections. And they did that because I suppose they might turn to be Congregationalists, which was the only other religion in Boston, if they tore the old church down first, because they'd have no church to worship. And the only remains of the old church is our communion table, which you see in the front of the chancel there, which is given to William and Mary in 1696. The Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Creed were painted on that canvas 1696 in London, England. And the pulpit came out of the old church. Dates back to 1717. It's supposed to be the oldest standing pulpit in the United States on its original site, still in constant use.
Today, nearly 275 years after the founding of King's Chapel, you don't have a regular congregation, do you?
Oh, yes, we do. We have about 500 members.
And regular services have been held almost regularly since
1688.
a considerable number of hours of preaching.
Sure was.
Well, what about the cemetery outside?
The heat in the church, as I just told you before, they brought the charcoal stoves to keep warm with. And the heat today comes from South Boston, Edison steam. Those people should wake up today and come to church. We told them heat comes 3 miles under the streets of Boston. They wouldn't believe it.
And the cemetery?
The cemetery, of course, is controlled by the city of Boston. We have nothing to do with it. And why it got its name, King's Chapel, we don't know. Because it was founded in 1630, and King's Chapel was built in the corner of it in 1688. And out there is buried Mary Chilton, the first white woman who stepped on Plymouth Rock, the landing of the Pilgrims. And of course, the reason why she's buried out here instead of Plymouth is, later on in life, she married Governor Winslow's son, so she came up to Boston to live with her husband. She's buried in the tomb. And William Dawes, the fellow that took the other ride with Paul Revere, is buried out here. Governor Winthrop, the first colonial governor of Massachusetts. Robert Keene, who was the first commander of the Ancient Honorable Artillery Company, which is the second oldest military organization in the world. And if you ever read Hawthorne's story, The Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne's buried out there. She died in 1704. Her given name is Elizabeth Payne. It says on the stone, "Here lies ye body of Elizabeth Payne, wife to Samuel Payne, aged near 52 years, depart this life November 1704.
And downstairs, under King's Chapel,
And downstairs we have about 24 tombs and about 800 people buried down there. Our bell in the belfry was made by Paul Revere and his son. It weighs 2,475 pounds, made of bronze and silver. And our communion tankard also was made by Paul Revere. We still use them today. And these two of his grandsons worship in pew 33. That's in back of the royal pew.
what kinds of problems are involved in maintaining a historical shrine like this, Mr. Haynes?
Well, we've only changed one thing up in the attic. Of course, we have these beams. And the high-low troopers by Jeweler's bug get into them. About once a month, I go up in the attic there and look around. I saw this sawdust and didn't want it. I got a pole and poked it and went way up. And it seems that this bug is just the opposite of the termite. The termite starts at the bottom of the building. This starts at the top. And they found out that this was the second building in the United States was attacked by that bug. It's a Danish bug.
You have to hand it to the bug. He had good judgment on where to chew, and he came a long distance to do it.
Sure, he came all the way from Denmark.
About the chapel bell, which was made by Paul Revere, is this bell still sounded on Sundays?
Oh, yes, ring it for every service.
How do you feel about people like Paul Revere and the others of his period? Do you think of them as human beings or as just dim historical figures?
No, human beings. I think that they're still around in the spiritual world. And now and then I think a lot of these old gentlemen are watching over me and the rest of us here at the church. I feel that way anyway.
This is the sound of the bell at King's Chapel, a bell made by Paul Revere, labeled by the maker himself as his sweetest work, and tolled by his request at his own funeral. Just down the street from King's Chapel, on the lawn of the City Hall, the first portrait statue erected in Boston, the familiar figure of Benjamin Franklin, done by Richard S. Greenough. One side of Franklin's face, as in life, is gay and smiling, the other side sober and sedate. On Brumfield Street nearby, the site of the Old Corner Bookstore, famed as a literary center, where Longfellow, Emerson, Hawthorne, Holmes, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Whittier, and Julia Ward Howe browsed and conversed. And around the corner on teeming Washington Street, the Old South Meeting House. The Old South Meeting House, where the outraged Boston colonists held the mass meetings which actually fired the Revolution. The Old South Meeting House, a dignified red brick building topped by a noble steeple, standing in pride against the backdrop of more recently constructed buildings. Guarding its preservation, ethically and philosophically, as well as practically, Mr. Charles Loring, an architect by profession.
To me, the maintenance of a beautiful building and one with all the historic associations is tremendously inspiring, especially as it is a shrine for free speech.
Under what circumstances was the Old South Meeting House erected?
Well, it was a meeting house. Now, the term is a little different from a church. The church in those days implied the Church of England, and a meeting house implied some of the Protestant offshoots from the Church of England. And the building was built in 1768 and has been there, as you can see, longer than the United States existed.
No longer used as a church, the meeting house is operated as a museum and meeting place by the Old South Association. Thus continues an impressive career, a career intimately involved in the events of American history.
Well, perhaps the most dramatic was the Boston Tea Party. There the colonists objected to the tax imposed on the tea, and they were a great tea-drinking community. And they organized, well, you might call it today a riot. A lot of the men dressed up as Indians to disguise themselves and assembled at the meeting house, and then adjourned and rowed out in rowboats to the tea ships and threw the crates of tea overboard as a protest against the tax.
A number of articles of interest are on display within Old South.
Perhaps the most unique specimen is a letter from George Washington, written to his dentist in Boston, with drawings of the way the dentist had made 4 of his false teeth, which were wrong, and drawings of the way that false teeth should have been made. So we have a sort of feeling that no wonder he had this fighting, if you'll excuse the phrase, mug on him, as long as his false teeth didn't fit.
The name of Joseph Warren is mentioned frequently in any discussion of early Boston. A public-spirited citizen and a doctor, he helped to provide leadership prior to the American Revolution. What, in your opinion, Mr. Loring, was Warren's outstanding characteristic?
I should say deliberate courage, even to his final death on Bunker Hill.
Do you think Warren and his friends and neighbors realized the implications of their revolutionary activities?
I'm sure they did. They were good Britishers, and they knew that if you start a revolution against the king, as they said that in one convention, that if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. Well, they knew that this was life or death for them. Give me liberty or give me death.
We find ourselves in another moment of crisis in history, a moment in which the role of the American people and nation includes leadership. What kind of a message comes out of Old South Meeting House in its perpetuity to us today?
Freedom and courage. Freedom to do what our conscience tells us to do, and courage to face the dangers that are involved in doing it.
Can we respond to the need of the hour? Can we find here at Old South Meeting House part of the courage we require to sustain our freedoms?
I'm sure we've obviously got it. There isn't a question in my mind. We've got the courage. It's a question of whether we've always got the most common sense solution.
But certainly the tradition and heritage is here to be noted by anyone perceptive enough to see it.
It is. It's free speech, courage, liberty, and a respect for God.
When you walk through Old South, is the spirit and the feeling still there? What do you sense?
I can almost see it populated by the men and women and soldiers and even the rioters of the days gone by.
So the time you devote to Old South on a volunteer basis is not time wasted.
I enjoy it.
And historical spots like this are worth preserving.
Oh, they must be, yes. To save our perspective and the background, to encourage us when we feeling low. Well, if our great-great-granddaddies did this, well, why can't we? We're certainly just as good as they were.
A quick visit to the old State House, formerly a British barracks. It was built in 1713 and later used by Generals Howe, Clinton, and Gage for conferences before the Battle of Bunker Hill. And, of course, in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read from the balcony to the cheering crowds on the street below, a street now marked by a circle of cobblestones in the pavement, It commemorates the site of the Boston Massacre. Next, Faneuil Hall, the cradle of liberty, where some of the earliest and most intensive town meetings seeking complete freedom were held.
Hey, who wants an oven-ready turkey here? Get your turkeys! Turkeys! $59 a pound with steak, sir.
The turmoil of Boston's market district surrounds Faneuil Hall, widely known as the cradle of liberty. You enter the hallway, the din fades, and you become aware of the melodic message of Westminster chimes, which are played every hour. In his office, Hector Campbell, superintendent of Faneuil Hall. Mr. Campbell, where does Faneuil Hall fit into history?
Well, just before we start, we'll correct you on the pronunciation. I go along with Noah Webster. He says it's Faneuil.
So it's Faneuil.
That's right.
Peter Faneuil was a highly successful Boston merchant who felt that Boston should have a market house. In July 1740, therefore, he made an offer to build, out of his own pocket, a market, donating it to the town. The accidentally built hall over the stalls of the market is one of the most prominent rooms in world history. How long did it take to build Faneuil Hall?
Well, he started in 1740 and it was completed in 1742. But in 1761, it was destroyed by fire.
Restored, the building began to acquire historical significance. It became the center of revolutionary movements in Boston and the colonies. It was used by British officers as a playhouse during the siege of Boston. Throughout the years, hundreds of thousands of words of praise and protest in Faneuil Hall.
Oh, yes, and of course they had the meetings that led up to the Boston Tea Party, including the first meeting. And of course they adjourned from here and they went up to the Old South Meeting House. And Washington was here before and after the Revolution.
Even today, Faneuil Hall continues its tradition as a home plate for freedom of speech and expression. During World War II, various groups recorded material here for short-waving to underground groups in Europe. Oppressed people behind the Iron Curtain today hear messages directly from this cradle of liberty. Outside Mr. Campbell's office, at the top of a steep stairway, you look up at the wall and you see...
Well, looking up, if you look right up the hall, you see the big painting of the Webster-Haynes debate.
The Webster-Haynes debate painting is the largest framed painting in America, 16 by 30 feet. The scene is the United States Senate in 1830. And of course the stage...
Of course the stage is about 30 foot long and has been that way since 1850.
The phrase cradle of liberty originated with John Adams, was later used by Daniel Webster. Around the walls, portraits also of Warren, Knox, Commodore Preble, Governor Caleb Strong, Edward Everett, and other notables of the past. Faneuil Hall also is the headquarters of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, founded in 1637. What else is there to see here, Mr. Campbell?
Well, after you visit the Armory of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company, I like to suggest, before you leave us, you look up above the cupola and see our famous weather vane.
The grasshopper weather vane has been quietly sitting on top of Faneuil Hall, watching the progress of Boston and the events of the day ever since the 1700s. Both the weather vane and the building were designed to last. Move along into the congested north end of Boston, a short distance away from the Boston waterfront to the Paul Revere House. Walk the winding hilly streets. Stop at 19 North Square, at the oldest house in Boston, probably built in the 1670s. Here Paul Revere lived, buying the place for about $1,000, part cash, part mortgage. From this house he presumably left for the Boston Tea Party in 1773, disguised as an Indian. And he was living here with his family when he set out on his historic ride to Lexington in April 1775. Walk up to the door, grasp the old-fashioned ring knocker, and ask for admission.
Good
Good afternoon, folks. We're glad to greet you here at the Paul Revere House. We assume that people visiting the house know who Paul Revere was and about some of the things that he did. But things are well marked here in the house. We allow people to browse around to suit themselves, and we'll very gladly answer any questions that you might have.
You're greeted by custodian Garner Corson, who's been a guide here for almost 25 years. Step from the hallway into the first floor front room. Note the wide pine boards on the floor, the colonial moldings and furnishings, the leaded diamond windows. Ask Mr. Corson for more details about the house.
Yeah, well, of course, it's an English Tudor-type house with low studding, and from the street side of the house you can see the overhang that is typical of Tudor-type houses. And of course, as you enter the front door, coming in off the street, you walk into a large living room which has a large fireplace with a Dutch oven and a large trammel iron for hanging pots and pans over the fireplace, and it is furnished in the colonial period.
When did Revere actually live in the house?
He owned the house from 1770 till 1800. Of course, I think some of that time, during the Revolution, he was forced to leave on account of the danger to his own life, and although his family stayed in the house, he went to Watertown and lived for a while.
How many children were there in the Revere family?
Well, they claim there were 16. There's 8 in each family. He's married twice, and 11 girls and 5 boys. And incidentally, he only had 5 survivors. He outlived all that crowd except 5. He lived to be almost 84 years old himself.
The majority of the children were raised in this house, a house which has the living room and the kitchen on the first floor, 2 bedrooms on the second.
Well, there were, I think they say there were 10 of them born here in this house.
Often, when we think about historical figures like Paul Revere, we forget that they were really human beings also.
That's right.
Well, here we had a man who, by his own hard work, not only became a clever craftsman and a highly successful businessman, but a man who risked all and everything for his patriotism.
That's right. He was mixed up in everything that had to do with government here during the colonial period. Was largely instrumental in the ratification of the Constitution. He used a great lot of persuasion on John Adams to have that thing put through.
Oh, he and Adams were buddies then.
Oh, yeah, he and Adams were buddies, and Prescott. He hobnobbed with all the big politicians.
He had many facets in his life, personality, and background, this man Revere.
He did a lot of different things. Among some of the things that he did, he made false teeth, and he did printing and engraving, and quite a number of things.
As you stand here in the living room of the Paul Revere house, you listen to the same sounds which were familiar to this great patriot when he, too, stood on this spot, the opening and closing of the door between the living room and the kitchen. And overhead, filtering through the low studded ceiling, the creaking of footsteps as they moved across the bedroom floor. Step out of the Paul Revere house, into the bus again, and move away through the heavy traffic, this time headed for the waterfront. Moments later, catch your first glimpse of a grand old fighting ship, still commissioned, but out of action. The U.S. frigate Constitution, Old Ironsides.
Now, as I earlier said to you, Old Ironsides was officially christened the U.S. frigate Constitution. She was engaged in 44 major naval engagements and never suffered a defeat. It was on August the 19th, during the War of 1812, that she gained her nickname Old Ironsides, for at that time she was engaged in battle with a British man of war, the Guerriere. A captured British officer on board Old Ironsides observed how several of the cannonballs from the Guerriere were bouncing harmlessly off the stout oak sides of Old Ironsides, and so he with an oath exclaimed that her sides must be made of iron. Well, of course they were not, but the American sailors quickly picked up this little tidbit and nicknamed their ship Old Ironsides, and so she has been affectionately known to us all ever since. Now, Old Ironsides is still a commissioned warship in the United States Navy. This makes her, therefore, the oldest commissioned warship in our Navy to date.
Before leaving Old Ironsides, ring the ship's bell smartly. One final stop, Bunker Hill Monument. Bus driver Earl Howland again narrates.
Directly ahead of us now stands the Bunker Hill Monument. The monument is 221 feet high. It is 30 feet square at the base, 15 feet square at the top. Within it there are 294 winding stairs going up, and I assure you the same number coming down. The cornerstone was laid in 1825 by the Marquis de Lafayette, the beloved Frenchman who helped our nation out so very much during the Revolutionary period. The dedicatory address was presented by Daniel Webster, one of America's most fiery orators. Now, the monument is called the Bunker Hill Monument, as we all know. And as we look at it, it brings back good memories and nostalgic memories of the spirit of '76. But there is one thing crucially wrong here. The monument is not standing on Bunker's Hill. It is standing on Breed's Hill. And I imagine that just about everybody...
Mr. Howland colorfully describes the battle. A battle in which the British lost nearly 50% of their attacking force. The Americans about 25%. Out of the battle came the famous words, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The clash between the Americans and the British ebbed and flowed, as did the blood. It was a furious conflict, and toward the end it was fought hand to hand.
By sheer force of numbers, the British soldiers stormed the redoubt, and fierce hand-to-hand battle took place at that point with musket butts, swords, rocks, sticks, anything, until the Americans were actually driven off the top of Breed's Hill. They scurried across Roxbury Neck under the supporting fire of Colonel Stark and Breed. The American forces spent the night on Prospect Hill in Somerville, while the British lads collapsed in exhaustion on their muskets on the side of Breed's Hill. On the following morning, June the 18th, the British lads retreated back across Boston Harbor, never again to set foot on the mainland of Massachusetts.
There are other places of historical interest to visit in Boston. Copp's Hill Burying Ground, where, starting in 1660, the colonists began to place their dead. The Boston Stone, brought from England about 1700, used for the grinding of paint. The Harrison Gray Otis House, Boston's best example of a late 18th century mansion. And Province Steps, which led to the historic and magnificent estate of Peter Sargent. The tour is complete. But the tour is not complete. You must return now to Boston, not on a weekday, but on a Sunday. Return to attend one of the regular services at the Old North Church. Walk slowly across the Paul Revere Mall, past Cyrus Dallon's equestrian statue of Revere. Listen as the subdued din of early Sunday traffic merges into another kind of sound. As you approach Old North Church, the reverent steeple peers placidly at you against the skyline. Walk slowly toward the church, one of the most famous in American history, and listen to the royal peal of those 8 bells made in 1744 in England, and still called the best and sweetest sounding bells in America, even after 200 years of continuous use. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, says the melody of this ancient hymn. For mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people, said the text from Isaiah when the first sermon was preached inside this remarkable, well-preserved building. Here is the oldest existing church edifice in the city of Boston. Construction was begun in 1723. located close to the harbor, from whose use Boston prospered in commerce. The Old North Church had 22 sea captains among its original subscribers. They and the other parishioners left for us a building of perfect proportions and sensitive detail. A building of perfect harmony. Stroll through this courtyard. Admire its old, well-weathered brick. Move toward the main entrance to the church as the organist starts the prelude. The organ on which he plays had its origin in one built in 1759 by Thomas Johnston of Boston. It was one of the first organs built in the United States, and some of the pipes visible on the front of the case are the original pipes, still functioning. Move through the short vestry and into the church itself. Make your way quietly to a seat in one of the high box pews. Sit in relaxed meditation as you wait for the service to begin. The prelude ends. The vicar and his assistants enter and commence the service.
And we open our service by singing hymn 309.
Look forward toward the altar. The tablets there contain the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. The choir is in the back of the church, so as not to distract from the service. Brass chandeliers, lighted for the first time on Christmas Day, 1724, still serve.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Praise ye the Lord.
The service continues in much the same form in use continuously since 1723. There are the first and second lessons from the Bible, the Apostles' Creed, the prayers are said, another hymn is sung. The vicar prepares for his sermon of the day.
God, our great companion, lead us ever more deeply into the knowledge of thy life and ours, and make us faithful interpreters of life to our fellows, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Gospel for this Sunday is the story of the feeding of the 4,000. Now, whether it be the feeding of the 4,000 or the 5,000, these stories are exciting stories.
The vicar speaks from the wine-glass pulpit, elevated high above the pews, so that all, including those seated in the gallery, can see and hear. The sermon concludes with a prayer.
Teach us, good Lord, to serve thee as thou deservest, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for any reward, save that of knowing that we do thy will, all which we ask in our Saviour's name. Amen.
The vicar slowly, respectfully, with dignity, descends the circular stairway from the pulpit to the floor level. Then he officiates at the offertory, which is soon completed. The closing prayer is phrased. The Johnston organ, the choir, and the bells blend together. The vicar recites the benediction.
Peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in knowledge and love of God, and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, be amongst you and remain with you always.
The Old North Church. Leave it now refreshed by its service, inspired by the knowledge that similar services here have been attended by many generations of patriots, Americans of recent immigration as well as old-line Yankees. Walk again through the beautiful courtyards and gardens outside the church, through a side door, and into a study where the vicar of Old North, the Reverend Howard P. Kellett, awaits you. Howard Kellett has been vicar of Old North for several years. He's friendly, soft-spoken.
As you undoubtedly know, this church was opened for public worship back in the year 1723. It tells the story of a group of people who wanted something lovely, and they labored for some 20 years to build the church as you now see it.
The church also tells another story.
It also tells the story of the skills of the artisans of colonial America. The church is after the design of Sir Christopher Wren. For Wren, when he designed churches of this nature, was particularly anxious to get light into the building. And here at the Old North we have clear glass windows that are kept clean so we still can see outside into a community.
Wren was anxious to get the light in as well as out.
Well, Wren was anxious to get the light in because the church was doing what the church should have been doing, encouraging people to learn to read. And in our chancel you see the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and the Creed in the language of the people.
People come to the Old North Church not only from the immediate community of Boston's North End, but from every state in the Union and many foreign countries. They come to Old North because
to these people, this church is a symbol of liberty and freedom.
Buried in the tomb beneath the church are such patriots as Major John Pitkin, who led the Royal Marines in their march to Lexington and Concord, and who was fatally wounded in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Here lies also Samuel Nicholson, the great naval hero and first commander of the frigate Constitution, Old Ironsides. The name of Paul Revere is also interlaced with the history of Old North.
He came to worship in this church with his oldest son, who was a member of this church. But a story about Revere that I like, as pertains to the Old North, is that when he was only a boy of 15 years of age, he came with 7 of his friends because something very exciting had come to this church, the first peal of bells in the North American continent. And with 7 of his friends, they started a bell ringers guild, and we still ring those bells every Sunday morning before our service of worship.
The bells in Old North are still rung the same way Paul Revere used, tugging hard on the rope attached to each bell. Back in the tower now, for a moment in your mind's eye, you see these ropes in the hands of a soiled and perspiring 15-year-old boy, a goldsmith's apprentice. From the inside of the tower, standing beside the bells, you hear, as Paul Revere and his friends heard, the mechanical movement of the bells themselves, and the echo of the song drifting in from the street. Now back to Vicar Kellett. This tower also was to have significance in the life of Paul Revere for another reason, a reason which showed itself years later, in April 1775.
And when you think of April the 18th in the year 1775, to my mind comes not only Revere, but the young sexton of this church, actually the janitor of this church, Robert Newman, who was given the task of waiting within the walls of this church as to how the British were coming on that fateful evening.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Thus, from Paul Revere and others like him, Old North Church became immortal, and with lessons from which we can learn today.
Here at the Old North, you sense the struggle that men went through in order to gain those two precious words, liberty and freedom.
Liberty and freedom, live words in this church. And another word, synonymous, the word struggle.
The word struggle is not something of the past alone, but it is of the present, and liberty and freedom will never be maintained and continued unless people are willing to struggle to see that it is always with us.
To see that liberty and freedom are always with us. That's the challenge of those American patriots who established and built Old North, and who fought for the symbol of liberty, which is Boston. Patriots who established the first free primary school in America. Patriots who ran for public office willingly and without selfish motives. For as they looked through these clear glass windows and sighted community need, they responded with action. Action embedded in the inevitable parade of history, of which each of us plays his own part.